There is a moment nobody talks about. Not the fights, not the tears, not the dramatic goodbye. None of that. The moment nobody talks about is quieter than all of it. It happens on an ordinary Tuesday or a Sunday morning, or somewhere between your second cup of coffee and the notification you used to wait for. It happens when you look at their name on your screen and feel absolutely nothing. Not anger, not longing, not even disappointment. Just nothing. And the nothing doesn't scare you the way you thought it would. That's the moment. That's what happens when an empath finally stops caring. And if you've ever felt it, or if you're feeling it right now, this is for you. Most people assume that when someone like you stops caring, something must have broken inside you. That you've gone cold, that you've become someone you promised yourself you'd never be. The people around you might even say it out loud. You've changed. You're not yourself. You used to be so warm. And the strange part is, they're not entirely wrong. You have changed. But what they don't understand, what almost nobody understands, is that the person you used to be wasn't your truest self. That version of you was exhausted. That version of you was performing. That version of you had learned somewhere along the way that love was something you earned by making yourself endlessly, quietly available, and that if you stopped being available, you would stop being loved. And so you kept going. You kept showing up. You kept answering at midnight and softening your words and swallowing your needs and translating their silence into something more generous than it probably was. Here is what nobody tells empaths. Caring too much doesn't make you a better person in a relationship. It makes you invisible. Every time you prioritize someone else's comfort over your own truth, you disappeared a little. Every time you talked yourself out of your own feelings to protect theirs, you moved further away from yourself. Every time you gave the benefit of the doubt to someone who had already used up every benefit, every doubt, you taught your nervous system that your needs were negotiable. And the body keeps score. It always does. You can ignore a wound for a long time, but you cannot ignore it forever. At some point, the body simply stops volunteering. That is what detachment actually is. It's not cruelty. It's not indifference. It's not you becoming someone cold or closed or damaged. Detachment is your system finally, after all this time, deciding it cannot do this particular pattern one more time. It is a biological event as much as an emotional one. Think about what you were doing every single day inside that dynamic. You were scanning, constantly, reading the temperature of the room the moment you walked in, checking the tone of a text message for hidden meaning, bracing before phone calls, rehearsing conversations in your head before you had them, and then replaying them afterward to figure out what you did wrong. That level of vigilance is not sustainable. It was never sustainable. And when your nervous system finally lowers the alert, when it finally stops scanning for threats inside a relationship that was supposed to feel like home, that stillness, that sudden quiet gets mistaken for not caring. But it's not. It's your body coming home to itself for the first time in a long time. Now let's talk about what the other person experiences when this happens. Because this is where things get complicated, and this is where empaths most often get pulled back in. When you detach, the person who benefited from your overfunctioning feels something shift. They can't name it immediately, but they feel it in the texture of your responses. You reply a little slower. You don't follow up. You stop asking the extra question that used to hold the conversation together. You stop doing the emotional maintenance that kept the whole thing running. And without that maintenance, without your constant invisible labor, the relationship reveals what it actually was. Not a partnership, a system. A system in which one person did the feeling for both of them, and the other person had the luxury of not having to feel very much at all. When that system stops working, the other person panics. Not because they miss you, though sometimes they do, but because they miss what you provided. They miss the ease of being forgiven before they'd even apologized. They miss being understood without having to do the work of being understood. They miss the version of you that absorbed their inconsistency and returned it somehow as patience. And so they reach out. They come back warmer than you've ever seen them. They say the things you spent years waiting to hear. And for an empath, for someone who is wired to feel, to hope, to believe in the possibility of people, This can feel like everything you ever wanted just landed at your door. This is the most dangerous moment in your healing. Not the silence, not the grief. This moment, right here, when they return wearing the face of the person you always believed they could be. Because the question is never whether they're capable of being that person in a single moment of fear. The question is whether they are willing to be that person consistently, when there is no threat of losing you. Anyone can be loving when they're scared of losing something. Growth looks different. Growth shows up before it has to. So what do you do with the nothing? What do you do when you realize the pull is gone and the silence where that pull used to live is actually starting to feel like relief? You stay there. You resist the urge to fill it. You resist the urge to explain it, to justify it, to apologize for it. You let the calm exist without interrogating it. Because for someone who has spent years treating their own nervous system like a problem to be managed, stillness can feel suspicious. Peace can feel like something is wrong, but nothing is wrong. For the first time in a long time, nothing is wrong. And you are only just beginning to remember what it feels like to take up space without bracing for impact. You don't notice it happening in real time. That's the thing about the slow erosion of a person who feels everything. It doesn't announce itself. There's no single day you can point to and say, that's when I started disappearing. It happens the way water shapes stone. Gradually, invisibly, and then all at once. One morning you wake up and realize you've been editing yourself for so long that you can't remember what the unedited version sounds like. You've been softening your tone, shrinking your needs, laughing at things that didn't feel funny, staying quiet when everything inside you wanted to speak. And somewhere in the middle of all that shrinking, you started calling it love. This is the part that's hardest to say out loud. For many empaths, love and self-abandonment became the same thing so early and so quietly that they never learned to tell them apart. If you grew up in an environment where keeping the peace meant keeping yourself small, where being easy to be around was the price of being accepted, then you didn't learn love as something mutual. You learned it as something you performed. You learned that your value in a relationship was tied to your usefulness inside it, to how well you could read the room, manage the mood, prevent the conflict before it started. And that lesson didn't disappear when you became an adult. It followed you into every room, every relationship, every moment. Where someone you cared about was struggling and your entire body said, fix it, smooth it, make it better. Make them comfortable, make yourself invisible if that's what it takes. That's not a character flaw. That's a survival strategy that outlived its usefulness. And here's what makes it so difficult to unlearn. It worked, at least partially. People did stay. Relationships did hold together for a while because of your effort. The problem is that what held them together wasn't genuine connection. It was your labor. And labor, when it only flows in one direction, eventually runs out. You can sustain it for months. Some people sustain it for years. But the body knows the difference between giving freely and giving because you're afraid of what happens if you stop. And one day, without any dramatic announcement, it simply refuses to keep going. What comes next is something most people on the outside will misread entirely, because when you stop overfunctioning, when you stop being the emotional architect of every interaction, things get uncomfortable fast. The silences grow longer, the texts get shorter. The energy you used to pour into maintaining warmth and closeness is suddenly just gone, and the space it leaves behind feels enormous. To you, it might feel like numbness, a strange, unfamiliar quiet where the anxiety used to live. But to the other person, to anyone who relied on your overgiving without ever acknowledging it, your withdrawal feels like an attack, like you've done something to them, like the problem is your absence, not the dynamic that made your absence inevitable. This is where the projections start. You'll hear things like, you've changed, or you're being cold, or I don't know who you are anymore. And there will be a part of you, the part that was trained to keep everyone comfortable, that wants to rush in and reassure them, to explain yourself, to soften the landing, to say, no, I'm still here, I'm still the same, I'm still safe, I'm still yours. But that impulse, as familiar as it is the old pattern trying to resurrect itself. Because the truth is, you have changed. And that change is not something to apologize for. The version of you that is no longer available for one-sided connection is not a lesser version of you. It is the most honest version of you that has ever shown up in that relationship. Here's something worth sitting with. The people who genuinely love you, not your usefulness, not your availability, not the version of you that never says no, those people will not be threatened by your boundaries. They will not punish you for having needs. They will not respond to your wholeness with confusion or resentment. Real love does not require you to disappear inside it. If someone in your life can only stay close to you when you are endlessly accommodating, what they love is not you. What they love is the access you gave them. And those are two completely different things. The moment you understand that distinction, something fundamental shifts. It's not a dramatic shift. It doesn't feel like a breakthrough in the way people describe breakthroughs in movies. It feels quieter than that. It feels like setting down something very heavy that you'd been carrying for so long you'd forgotten it wasn't part of your body. It feels like breathing slightly easier, like a background noise you'd stopped noticing has finally switched off. And in that quiet, you start to hear something you haven't heard in a long time. Your own voice. Not the voice that manages and smooths and translates and accommodates. Your actual voice with its actual needs and its actual limits and its actual truth. And here's where the real work begins, because detachment is not the destination. It is the clearing. It's the moment fog lifts enough for you to finally see the landscape clearly, maybe for the first time. What you do in that clearing matters enormously. Some people, the moment they feel the relief of detachment, immediately look for someone new to pour themselves into. A new project, a new person, a new cause. Anything to fill the space where the overgiving used to live. But the space isn't a problem to be solved. The space is the point. It is in that space, in that unusual and slightly uncomfortable stillness, that you finally get to ask yourself the question that changes everything. Not what do they need from me, but what do I actually need? What have I always needed? What did I keep putting last because I was too busy making sure everyone else was first? That question is not selfish. That question is the beginning of becoming someone who can love other people without destroying themselves in the process. That question is the doorway, and you are standing right at the edge of it. There is a particular kind of grief that nobody prepares you for. It's not the grief of losing a person. It's the grief of losing the version of yourself that believed if you just tried harder, gave more, stayed longer, loved louder, things would eventually balance out. That belief kept you going for a long time. It was, in its own painful way, a form of hope. And hope, even when it's misplaced, even when it's costing you everything, is not easy to let go of. Because letting go of hope means admitting something you didn't want to admit. That the imbalance wasn't a temporary condition, it wasn't a phase they were going through or a wound they were healing from, or a communication style you just hadn't figured out how to reach yet. The imbalance was the relationship. It was the foundation the whole thing was built on. And once you see that clearly, you cannot unsee it. The fantasy collapses. And grieving a fantasy is one of the loneliest things a person can do, because from the outside, nothing has ended. The relationship might still technically exist. The person is still in your phone, still in your life, still sending the occasional message. But something is over. The version of the story you were telling yourself, the one where your consistency would eventually inspire theirs, where your softness would eventually teach them safety, where love would eventually be enough. That story is finished, and you are standing in the wreckage of a future that was never going to happen, mourning something that most people around you cannot even see. This is why empaths often feel so profoundly alone in their healing, because the loss isn't visible in the way other losses are. There's no clear ending to point to, no moment everyone agrees was the breaking point. Just a slow accumulation of quiet realizations, each one arriving like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through everything you thought you understood about the relationship, about yourself, about what love is supposed to feel like. And because the loss isn't visible, the grief isn't validated. People don't bring you food, they don't check in, they don't say, "I'm so sorry, that must be so hard." They say things like, "You're better off," or "I never liked them anyway," or "At least you figured it out," as though figuring it out doesn't hurt. as though clarity doesn't have a cost. But here is what that grief is telling you, if you're willing to listen to it. Underneath the ache, it's telling you that you loved genuinely, that you showed up with your whole self, with real vulnerability, with actual investment. The grief is proof that you were not the problem in the dynamic. People who never really cared don't grieve like this. People who were only going through the motions don't feel the specific bone-deep exhaustion, or realizing that what they gave was never going to be returned in kind. The grief belongs to the people who tried. And you tried. You tried in ways the other person may never fully understand, because they never had to try the way you did. They had the luxury of your effort carrying them, and now that effort has been withdrawn, and the grief is yours, and it is real, and it deserves to be honored before you move forward. So how do you move through it without getting stuck inside it? Because there is a difference between processing grief and marinating in it. There is a difference between honoring what you lost and using the loss as a reason to stay exactly where you are. The first step is the hardest, and it requires a level of honesty that can feel almost brutal. You have to stop romanticizing the moments that kept you holding on. The empath's mind is extraordinarily good at curating, at pulling up the best version of a person on demand, at replaying the one conversation where they were soft, the one night where things felt easy, the one moment where you caught a glimpse of who they could be and decided that glimpse was worth everything that surrounded it. That curation is not love. That is hope, operating as selective memory. And as long as your mind keeps returning to the highlight reel, it cannot honestly assess the full picture. The full picture includes the patterns, not the exceptions, the patterns, how they consistently behaved when you needed something, how quickly your needs became an inconvenience in their hands, how many times you left a conversation feeling smaller than when you entered it, how often you found yourself explaining your emotions to someone who seemed to view your emotional life as a complexity they hadn't signed up for. The full picture also includes you, how you felt in your body during the worst moments of that dynamic, the tightness before certain conversations, the way you mentally prepared yourself to manage their reaction before you'd even said a word, the relief, and notice that word, relief, you felt on the days when they were simply in a good mood and nothing was required of you. Relief should not be the emotional ceiling of a relationship. Relief is not the same as joy, and you deserve joy. Moving through the grief also requires you to resist one of the most seductive traps available to someone in your position, the trap of explanation, the desire to sit them down, to lay it all out, to make them understand exactly what happened and why and how their behavior contributed to it. This impulse comes from a generous place. It comes from your belief that if people truly understood the impact of their actions, they would want to do better. And maybe that's true for some people. But the person who required you to disappear in order to feel comfortable is not always the person who will receive your explanation with gratitude and growth. More often, the explanation becomes another opportunity for them to reframe the narrative in their favor. Another conversation where you end up managing their feelings about what they did to yours. You do not owe anyone your emotional labor in the very moment you're trying to stop giving it away for free. What you do owe yourself is this, the truth about what the experience taught you. Not about them, about you. About the places inside yourself that were still hungry for something when you entered that dynamic. About the beliefs you were carrying, perhaps without knowing it. About what you had to do to be worth loving. About the moments where you saw the signs early and chose to interpret them generously rather than accurately. That is not self-blame. That is self-knowledge. And self-knowledge, uncomfortable as it is to come by, is the thing that ensures yai. Oh, don't walk into the same room with a different person's name on the door. Because here is the quiet, uncomfortable truth that sits at the center of every empath's healing journey. The patterns that drain you don't just find you. On some level, in some chapter of your story, you made a home for them. Not because you are broken, not because you deserve to be treated poorly, but because something inside you recognized the dynamic as familiar, as normal, as the shape love was supposed to take. And familiarity, even painful familiarity, has a pull that safety sometimes cannot match. Until now, until this moment, standing in the clearing, holding the grief, Finally ready to ask what you actually want love to feel like, not just what you've been willing to settle for. There is a version of you on the other side of this that you haven't fully met yet. Not the version that is hardened or guarded or so protected that nothing can get in. Not the version that has decided love is too expensive and connection is too risky and people are too disappointing to bother with. That version is not healing. That version is just pain wearing a different outfit. The version of you on the other side of this is something rarer and more difficult to build than toughness. It is someone who has learned to be open and discerning at the same time. Someone who can feel deeply without losing themselves inside the feeling. Someone who can care about another person without making that care into a contract where they always pay and the other person always receives. That version of you is not a fantasy. It is not something reserved for people who had easier starts or simpler histories. It is available to you. But it requires something most people are never willing to do. It requires you to change not just who you choose, but how you show up before the choosing even begins. Because here is what the last relationship or the last friendship or the last dynamic that drained you dry was actually showing you. It was showing you the unfinished business inside yourself. The places where you still believed on some level beneath logic that being needed was the same as being loved. That if you could just make yourself indispensable enough, patient enough, understanding enough, the love would eventually arrive in the form you actually needed it. That belief is not a personal failure. It is an inheritance. It was handed to you by environments and experiences that taught you love was conditional, that it had to be earned, that it would be withdrawn if you asked for too much or took up too much space, or had needs that were inconvenient. And you adapted, because that is what intelligent, sensitive people do. They adapt. They learn the rules of the room they're in, and they follow them, even when the room is not worthy of their presence. The work now is not to become someone who doesn't feel. The work is to feel without flinching, and to act from that feeling honestly, rather than managing it into something more palatable for people who cannot handle your full truth. That is a profound shift. It sounds simple when it's written down, and it is anything but simple to practice in the actual texture of real relationships, where history is complicated and feelings are layered and the old grooves run very deep. But it starts with something small. It starts with noticing the moment you are about to edit yourself for someone else's comfort, and pausing there. Not necessarily stopping. Sometimes softening your delivery is genuine care rather than self-erasure, but pausing long enough to ask whose needs are being centered in this moment, yours or theirs, and whether centering theirs is a choice you're making freely or a reflex you're performing out of fear. That question, practiced consistently, begins to change everything. Not overnight, not dramatically, but slowly, in the way that real change always happens, you start to develop a different relationship with your own instincts. You start to trust the tightness in your chest that appears when something is wrong, rather than talking yourself out of it. You start to believe the first read you have on a situation, rather than immediately interrogating it for bias and replacing it with something more charitable to the other person. You start to understand that your sensitivity is not a liability. It is extraordinarily precise information about the world around you, and you have been discounting it for years because you were taught that your perceptions were too much, or too sensitive, or unfair to people who didn't mean any harm. But intention and impact are not the same thing. Someone can mean no harm and still harm you, and you are allowed to respond to the impact rather than excusing it because of the intention. This is where your boundaries stop being reactions and start being expressions of who you are. Most people think of boundaries as walls, as defensive structures erected after someone has already gotten too close and done too much damage. And sometimes that's how they start. Reactive, protective, built in the aftermath of hurt. But mature boundaries are not walls. They are not about keeping people out. They are about being clear enough about what you value and what you need, that the right people know how to show up for you, and the wrong people self-select out before either of you wastes any more time. A boundary stated calmly and early is not aggression. It is information. It is you treating yourself as someone worth being honest about, And the response you get to that information tells you almost everything you need to know about whether this person belongs in the inner circle of your Ife. Now let's talk about what you do when they come back, because they often do. And when they do, they frequently return as the version of themselves you spent the entire relationship hoping would show up. Warm, attentive, apologetic, clear, saying things with an ease and openness that makes you wonder whether you imagined the whole history of difficulty between you. And there will be a part of you that wants to believe it. That part of you is not weak. That part of you is human. That part of you is the same part that made you a good person in the relationship even when the relationship wasn't good for you. The part that genuinely hopes for the best in people, that wants growth, to be real, that wants the story to have a different ending than the one you've been living. Honor that part of you, and then ask it to be patient, while a different, quieter part of you does the real assessment. Because what you are looking for is not a feeling. Feelings in reunion moments are almost always overwhelming and unreliable. What you are looking for is a pattern. You are looking for whether the behavior that hurt you is being named honestly, without deflection, without making your reaction the focus rather than their action. You are looking for whether the change they're presenting is showing up in small, consistent, unpressured moments, or only in the intensity of trying to win you back. You are looking for whether your boundaries, when you hold them this time, are met with respect or with a more sophisticated version of the same pressure that existed before. These things take time to observe. They cannot be assessed in a single conversation, no matter how good that conversation feels. And if they are not willing to give you the time it takes to observe them honestly, that is itself the information you needed. Here is what becomes possible when you finally stop caring about being chosen by people who require you to be less than you are. You become available, truly available, not just endlessly present, for the connections that can actually hold your full weight. You become capable of a kind of intimacy that was never accessible to you inside the old dynamic, because real intimacy requires two whole people, and you were never allowed to be whole in there. You start to notice different things in people, not just whether they're drawn to you, but whether they're curious about you, not just whether they need you, but whether they see you, not just whether the connection feels intense, but whether it feels safe. And safe for someone who has spent years in emotional chaos might feel almost boring at first, almost too quiet, almost like something is missing. What is missing is the anxiety. What is missing is the performance. What is missing is the constant, low-grade hum of trying to be enough for someone who had already decided you weren't. And once it's gone long enough, you realize it was never supposed to be there. The quiet is not emptiness. The quiet is what it feels like to finally be in a room where you don't have to earn your place at the table. You are not too much. You were never too much. You were simply too much for the wrong people. And the wrong people are not your destiny. They are your education. And you, standing here now, on the other side of the caring and the losing